and not Randall Smith, who was listed on the program as the person who's supposed to be chairing this session. The other negative is that you're stuck with me. But then if two negatives make a positive, we should be all right. My name is John Fort, and I'm from St. Anselm College in New Hampshire, and I'm very pleased to be chairing the session this afternoon on families, neighborhoods, and the built environment, a new paradigm for Notre Dame, which will be given by Philip Bess. Philip Bess is a professor at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture, where he began overseeing the graduate program in August of 2004. He teaches graduate urban design and theory and engages in professional work as a design consultant for municipalities, architects, and community development corporations working through the Office of Thursday Associates. From 1987 to 1988, he was the director and principal designer of the Urban Baseball Park Design Project of the Society for American Baseball Research, and in Boston in August 2000, he directed and coordinated the ultimately successful Save Fenway Park design charrette. And those of us from New England very happy about that. Professor Bess is the author of City Baseball Magic, Plain Talk and Uncommon Sense About Cities and Baseball Parks in 1989, Inland Architecture, Subterranean Essays on Moral Order and Formal Order in Chicago in 2000, and most recently, Till We Have Built Jerusalem, Architecture, Urbanism, and the Sacred, 2007. Professor Bess holds a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Virginia and a Master of Theological Studies in Church History from Harvard Divinity School. Please welcome Professor Philip Bess. This is the only clock I have, so. Okay, great. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I want to acknowledge at the outset the technical contributions to this lecture of several colleagues in the architecture school, specifically Al DeFries, Krukali Uplakar, and David Marnick. I also want to acknowledge and thank graduate architecture students Josh Eckert, Scott Ford, and Kalinda Brown for their assistance in helping me prepare the two very schematic drawings for the proposed graduate student village that I hope to show at the end of my talk. It also occurred to me this morning at about 4 a.m. that if we had a more sensible culture, I would simply refer you to the final verses of the Sermon on the Mount and the story of the three little pigs for the shorthand version of what I'm about to say. Winston Churchill said that we shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. And Churchill was right up to a point. We stand always in a reciprocal relationship to our physical culture and to our built environment in particular. We shape our buildings and then our buildings shape us. We shape some more buildings that in turn reshape us, which prompt us to reshape our buildings, etc. ad infinitum. Today I'm going to talk about the built environment generally as the physical form of a culture, and also specifically about the physical form of the little subculture here that is the University of Notre Dame. I'll talk specifically about architecture as the art of building, and about urban design as the art of designing the physical and spatial form of human settlements toward the end of human flourishing. And in the course of this, briefly, we'll say or allude to families, neighborhoods, and cities, to the Catholic social values of solidarity, subsidiarity, and stewardship, to excellence in the Notre Dame Graduate School, to environmental sustainability, especially as it relates to creating and sustaining a culture of durable traditional building at Notre Dame, and finally the opportunity for Notre Dame to better and more deeply model the Catholic Christian life toward the end of sacramentally participating in the city of God in a more visible way. It's hot in here, if you don't mind. I'm gonna... This is a conference about the family, and I feel obliged to say something about the family. but I'm very short of time and want to leave time for questions. So instead, I'm just going to show you these 3 slides and commend to you Gilbert Chesterton's 1905 essay on certain modern writers and the institution of the family, which is both a great defense of the family and a devastating critique of Friedrich Nietzsche. If typically paradoxical in its presentation, the essence of Chesterton's argument is an old one, that the family is the first school of life and one that is typically essential to the ultimate happiness of human beings. Not too long ago, Hillary Clinton and Rick Santorum had a kind of point-counterpoint exchange with the publication of their respective books, It Takes a Village and It Takes a Family, both published with reference to what each regards as necessary to raise a child to be well in the world. But arguably it takes both a good family and a good wider community, not only for children, but for human beings generally to be well in the world. And it is at this point that I wish to expand our focus from the family to a consideration of the kinds of communities and kinds of physical environments in which families themselves can flourish. There's a long history and tradition of both virtue ethics and urbanism that, although embodied throughout the ancient world, was in the West first articulated in Athens, a tradition that argues that the best life for human beings is the life of moral and intellectual excellence lived in a community with others, and especially in a polis, a city. For Aristotle, the polis is a community of communities that exists for and seeks the best life for its members. And first for the Athenians and later the Western world, this urban ideal was to some extent embodied by Athens. Just as in the Hebrew Scriptures, this ideal came to be embodied and symbolized by Jerusalem, by the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, as the Civitas Dei of St. Augustine, and visually here in Hubert and Jan van Eyck's 15th century Ghent altarpiece, where the brothers Van Eyck depict paradise as a blessed community of the faithful and the just, drawn from the church and throughout the world, gathered together in a new Eden against the backdrop of a new Jerusalem that looks remarkably like a 15th century Flemish city. Now, just as there is a reciprocal relationship between human habitat and human identity, so too is there a reciprocal relationship between these ideal cities and the real cities that both informed and are informed by the ideal. And real cities, both ancient and modern, invariably have environmental, economic, moral, and formal, which is to say physical and spatial, aspects. So it's good to know, for instance, that ancient Athens had a population about the size of contemporary South Bend. And also that a more typical Greek polis, Athens was atypically large, was, when you take into account its immediately adjacent agricultural landscape, roughly about the size of the University of Notre Dame in both population and area. It's important to know these things for at least 3 reasons. First, because it reminds us that the ancient city was, like medieval monasteries at an even smaller scale, both an urban and an agricultural unit. Second, because it drives home to us the relatively small size and scale of the polis as a self-governing community. And third, because in Western culture, from classical antiquity up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the city, and for a long period after the fall of Rome, the monastery, was conscious of itself as a community concerned with the well-being of its individual members over the course of their whole life. This cannot be said of the modern liberal bureaucratic city, let alone the modern bureaucratic state, neither of which are any longer communities except at the most abstract and metaphorical level. The modern city no longer sees its purpose as the well-being of all its citizens, no longer presumes to promote the best life for its citizens, and most especially, unlike the pre-modern city, does not attempt to shape the moral life of individual citizens according to shared character ideals. At best, the modern city establishes the material conditions within which its members find or construct our own worlds of meaning, resulting in an inherently fragile and unstable social condition for modern persons, that accentuates our individual freedom, but provides little, if any, guidance in acquiring the virtues necessary in order to live a good life. So here I want to suggest that in the modern West, there are perhaps only two major institutions that seek the good of their members over the course of their whole lives. And these are the family and the church. Certainly the state does not. Certainly the city, which once did, now does not. Certainly the university, which perhaps once did, now does not. And yet, if we understand correctly the Catholic Church's view of the university as recently articulated by Popes John Paul and Benedict, most especially John Paul's encyclical Ex Corde Ecclesiam, we must recognize that a Catholic university with a proper sense of its own identity pursues its mission as part of the larger community of the Church, and might therefore best understand its role entirely in terms of its place within and its shaping of the whole lives of its members, including its administrators, faculty, students, and employees. For to the extent that Notre Dame is a genuinely Catholic university, she is essentially a community of systematic truth seekers that pursues truth in the context of and as a participant in a worshiping community. No one at Notre Dame is required to worship in order to be a member of the community, but the distinctive character of Notre Dame as a place where truth is both pursued and considered in the context of a whole life is absolutely inseparable from Notre Dame's being also a worshiping community. And this is true whether it refers to the whole life of a student, a faculty member, an administrator, or a non-academic employee. Without suggesting that Notre Dame commonly or currently suffers from a lack of identity, let me speculate that if Notre Dame had a better sense of her Catholic identity, she would recognize her potential to be a community more like an Aristotelian polis than she currently is, and also more like an Aristotelian polis than it is possible for most communities in the modern world to be. To borrow the language of Peter Berger's and Richard Newhouse's mid-1970s essay, To Empower People, the Role of Mediating Structures in Public Policy, both the modern city and the modern university are examples of modern bureaucratic megastructures, what they call megastructures, whereas the modern small town, the city neighborhood, and perhaps a Catholic university, perhaps a Catholic university such as Notre Dame, may be examples of what Berger and Newhouse refer to as mediating structures. Indeed, in his address to the faculty this past September, University President John Jenkins likened Notre Dame to a city-state in its scope and complexity. Among the foremost of his objectives for Notre Dame, Father Jenkins cited becoming a truly great and truly Catholic university, unsurpassed in undergraduate education, with a superb graduate program. In support of the latter, he spoke of the introduction of additional university and campus ministry programs designed specifically for graduate students, a review of existing graduate housing, and the formulation of a graduate residential master plan. And he spoke of a university-wide commitment to issues of environmental sustainability, including a new Office of Sustainability, the mission of which is to, quote, integrate sustainability principles across all areas of the university, end quote. As both a professor and the director of graduate studies in the architecture school, I have to say that I think President Jenkins is onto something important here. And the rest of my talk this afternoon is about how thinking about Notre Dame literally as a polis, and specifically rethinking the building and campus design of Notre Dame and how we do those things here, would help advance the objectives Father Jenkins has outlined. To do this, however, I need to introduce some basic ideas from the fields of architecture and urban design. Specifically, in the time that remains, I want to talk about modern construction. I want to talk about traditional construction. I want to look at existing Notre Dame married and graduate student housing as instances of both modern construction and modern suburbanism. I want to look at an alternative paradigm, a traditional paradigm for Notre Dame campus design and construction, with a specific with a specific look at some informative existing precedents in Florida, Mississippi, and Belgium. And finally, I want to show at the very end, a schematic proposal to employ this paradigm for a new Notre Dame neighborhood for married students, graduate students, and interested faculty and staff. So I want to talk about modern construction. I'm going to switch into a kind of professional technical mode, running through some things, and I hope that what I have to say is clear, because there's a lot of stuff that I'm trying to pack into this. But I hope you'll see why it's essential. So I want to start out by talking about modern construction, and to begin with, talking about structure and enclosure. Arguably, the essential difference between modern construction and traditional construction has to do with modern construction's separation of structure from enclosure. What do I mean by this? Structure is what holds a building up, what allows it to stand, what allows a building to transfer into the ground both the constant load of its own weight, known as its dead load, plus the live loads to which a building is routinely subjected by its occupants and by external elements and forces such as wind, rain, snow, etc. Enclosure, on the other hand, is what separates the inside of the building from the outside of the building. And here's the key point. In traditional construction, the enclosure is structural. In modern construction, it is not. As we shall see, this has implications and consequences for both construction and aesthetics. In the early 1920s, the Swiss modernist architect Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, known to the world as Le Corbusier, provided a diagram of this distinction between modern and traditional construction in his polemical 5 points of the new architecture. The 5 points of the new architecture contrasting with traditional architecture were and are: 1, pilotis, that is a structural grid of columns rather than bearing walls. Secondly, roof gardens, that is making flat rather than pitched roofs and using the flat roof for private green space. Third, the free plan, which allows interior partitions to take any shape whatsoever from floor to floor. They don't stack up on top of each other because the interior partitions are not load-bearing. They are not structural. Fourth, the free facade, allowing windows anywhere on the surface of a building. Again, because windows and doors have been freed, quote unquote, from being openings in a load-bearing structural wall. And fifth, ribbon windows, that is, bands of continuous horizontal windows rather than the vertical windows that are necessitated by traditional construction. And here are 2 examples of Le Corbusier's theories applied to 2 iconic houses of early modernism. First, the Villa Savoy. These are the 3 slides in the center there. The Villa Savoy. And here, the Villa Stein. Both houses exemplifying most, if not all, of Le Corbusier's 5 points, and both serving as variations on the diagrammatic modern constructional frame on the left, here, that Le Corbusier called the Maison Domino. Now, there's no question that Le Corbusier recognized certain aesthetic opportunities in this new method of construction, which had been made possible above all by the growing industrialization of the building culture and indeed the entire modern economy. Nevertheless, Le Corbusier's enthusiasm for what he regarded as inevitable was at best short-sighted, and modern construction has long-term implications for buildings that Le Corbusier either did not anticipate or chose not to address, especially with respect to the durability of modern buildings, or rather, the lack of durability of modern buildings, of which I'll have more to say shortly. But to understand why modern buildings have durability problems, it is helpful to understand what architects and engineers mean when we speak of the ideas of compression, tension, and a building material's embodied energy and its coefficient of thermal expansion. So, compression and tension. In order for buildings to do what they are intended to do, buildings need to exist in a state of more or less constant static equilibrium. and must be able to transfer the forces to which they are routinely subject, their dead loads and their live loads, directly into the ground. If buildings cannot do this, the portions of the building under stress will begin to fail. And unattended, eventually the building itself may ultimately be unable to stand. Compression and tension refer to two different kinds of forces to which buildings and their components are commonly subject. In the most simple of terms, compression refers to forces that tend to press things together. All right, so you have the inward forces that cause compression. The inward forces cause compression, and the stress is called compressive stress. Okay? And tension refers to forces that tend to pull things apart. So the outward forces cause tension, the outward forces cause tension, and the stress is called tensile stress. And different materials possess different characteristics with respect to their capacity to accept compressive and tensile forces. For example, masonry, both stone and brick, is strong in compression and weak in tension. Solid masonry walls, such as the one on the left, are durable because they are strong in compression. And the openings in solid masonry walls are almost universally vertical rather than horizontal because a stone lintel above a window or door opening is limited by its weakness in tension to relatively short spans, as can be seen in all the windows in this in the building on the right, which is a traditionally constructed building. The compressive strength of masonry is likewise related to the structural significance of different kinds of arches, which are the most efficient means of spanning an opening in a masonry wall in such a way that the masonry doing the spanning is in compression rather than tension. Thus you have corbelled arches and voussoir arches, shown on the left. Lost my spot. Thus you have corbelled arches and voussoir arches and a diagram of why arches are more stable when they're surrounded by and supporting a wall than when they are standing alone. This slide and this slide together illustrate the compressive forces passing through a segmented arch. And this slide illustrates the direction of the compressive forces that are being carried by this stone arcade. In turn, here we have an illustration of a genuinely structural stone lintel, which is functioning similar to a beam, which is shown in the diagram on the right, illustrating how it is in compression at the top of the beam, how the stone is in compression at the top of the beam and in tension at the bottom of the beam. And here we have on the left this stone lintel, which is in tension, using a material that is weak in tension, juxtaposed with the components of a masonry arch on the right that are in compression and using materials that are strong in compression. Now, to consider the characteristics of two other building materials in contrast to masonry, which is strong in compression and weak in tension, heavy timbers are somewhat strong in both compression and tension, and steel is even stronger in both compression and tension, but steel also brings with it certain disadvantages, as we shall see. All physical things, from living things to natural objects to human artifacts, are subject to both compressive and tensile forces. And these forces in themselves are neither good nor bad, they simply are. Nevertheless, although the tensile structural strength of living things facilitates our animation, the most durable buildings are those, the components, particularly the external components of which, are in maximum compression and minimal tension, and which are themselves strong, made of materials which are themselves strong in compression. Thus it has been and remains the case that the most durable buildings that human beings make are solid, bearing wall masonry buildings with high-lime mortar and pitched roofs. Every building requires regular maintenance over time, but traditional pitched roof, solid wall masonry with high-lime mortar buildings both require less maintenance and employ a limited range of materials that themselves require less energy to produce. So here I want to bring up the issue of embodied energy. What is embodied energy in buildings? There are two forms of embodied energy in buildings. First, initial embodied energy, and second, recurring embodied energy. Initial embodied energy refers to the non-renewable energy consumed in acquiring raw materials for building material, in their processing, manufacture, and their transportation to the building site, and in the construction of the building, that is to say, how they are constructed. And initial embodied energy has two components, direct energy and indirect energy. Direct energy refers to the energy expended to bring building materials to a site and to construct the building itself. That is, it concerns both the proximate source of the building materials themselves as well as the methods used for assembling them on site. For example, in South Bend, using Italian marble requires more direct energy than using Indiana limestone because it comes from further away. Likewise, assembling a steel frame building with a crane requires more direct energy than laying up a solid masonry wall by hand because of the energy required to both make and operate the crane. Indirect energy refers to the energy used in the processing and manufacture of the materials themselves, including the cost of transporting their components from their point of origin in their raw state to their place of manufacture. In this chart, measured, and bear with me because I'm going to get away from all this statistical stuff eventually, but it's important to go through it. In this chart, measured in megajoules per kilogram, it is evident first that what we're talking about are, I'm going to be looking at these materials up here and their relative embodied energy. Okay, so the chart indicates that the closer the finished material is to its natural state as taken from the earth, aggregate, which are rocks, straw bale, stone, lumber, brick, the lower is its indirect embodied energy. And second, the more complicated a materials manufacturing process, for example, for plywood, the stuff on this end of the scale, for plywood, fiberglass, insulation, steel, linoleum, aluminum, the higher are those materials' indirect embodied energy. Now, related to indirect energy is recurring embodied energy, which represents the non-renewable energy consumed to maintain, repair, restore, or replace materials, components, or systems over the life of the building. That is, it is directly related to the durability of a building's materials and how frequently a building requires renovation. In other words, the use of non-durable building materials now requires greater expenditures of embodied energy later. Something for those of us at Notre Dame to think about if we are indeed committed to an ethic of environmental stewardship and sustainability. Now, I'm going to return to this theme in a while, but at this point I want to bring up my last technical term, which is coefficient of thermal expansion. Building materials expand and contract with changes in temperature. For example, over a range of about 100 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit in South Bend, and the degree to which a material does so represents its coefficient of thermal expansion. Building materials may be regarded as relatively inert or relatively expansive. Stone, brick, timber, slate, and clay tile roofing, and high-lime mortar and cement are all relatively inert. Steel, Portland cement, mortar, and concrete, and asphalt shingles are all relatively expansive. Moreover, whereas traditional buildings make use of a relatively limited palette of inert materials bonded together, modern construction can be characterized as an assemblage of more expansive materials not so bonded together. This has resulted in a culture of building where it is common constructional practice to assemble high embodied energy materials with comparatively high coefficients of expansion to make buildings characterized by flat roofs, veneer walls, weep holes, metal ties,
and ubiquitous expansion joints that over annual freeze-thaw cycles test the durability of structural caulk or the newest alternative high-embodied energy synthetic sealants that the modern construction industry relies on to keep water out of its buildings. Now, here let me emphasize a point about water and the durability of buildings. Water is the enemy of buildings. Shedding water and keeping it away from a building is essential to its longevity. And flat roofs and modern construction materials and conventions are singularly vulnerable to water damage and consequently not durable. Did you ever wonder how, as Henry VIII perpetrated the dissolution of the English monasteries in the late 1530s, how he managed to completely destroy all those amazing complexes of buildings, such as Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire, which is illustrated here? The answer is, in many cases, his emissaries simply compromised the structural integrity of the roofs and allowed water to do the rest of the damage. Now, I mentioned earlier that modern construction, at least in comparison with traditional construction, is generally not integral in its use of materials. There's one significant exception: steel-reinforced concrete. Modern construction has come to rely on steel-reinforced concrete as a structural material for three reasons. First, both steel and Portland cement concrete have similar coefficients of expansion. That is, they are structurally complementary. Have similar coefficients of expansion, which means they can expand and contract more or less together. Second, concrete is strong in compression and steel is strong in tension. That is, they are structurally complementary. And third, the material itself permits a degree of plasticity that lends itself to a modernist architectural culture that wants above all else to make novel forms. And reinforced concrete lends itself to that purpose. These two images of a building currently under construction on campus illustrate some typical features of modern reinforced concrete construction, including the standard separation of the concrete frame structure from the partially completed masonry veneer wall, seen on the left, and the precast concrete representational arched openings that are shown on the right. Referring to this. Now, let me say that there are good reasons to believe that the new generation of neo-collegiate Gothic buildings that Notre Dame is currently building are likely to be more durable than the two generations of modernist buildings that immediately preceded them, if only because these newest Notre Dame buildings have pitched roofs and good gutters. However, despite the improvement and all other things being equal, the newest generation of buildings is not going to be so durable as the even older Notre Dame buildings that were built with traditional masonry bearing walls. The problem with the building illustrated here is that when steel-reinforced concrete is exposed to the elements and goes through repeated freeze-thaw cycles, reinforced concrete eventually begins to deteriorate. Water gets into the concrete and begins to rust the reinforcing steel, causing it to lose its tensile strength and ultimately, if the damage is bad enough, to fail structurally. And the likelihood of this is increased by the nature of modern construction itself, which, as I said, is an assemblage of relatively expensive high-embodied energy materials that are not integrally bonded to each other. Here, for example, is the exterior wall mock-up of another building currently under construction on campus, complete with weep holes and an expansion joint. It has a cast stone, quote-unquote, lintel that is not a real lintel, but is rather a representation of a lintel. The real structural detail is a variation of the details illustrated in this sequence of slides from my colleague Al DeFries, which shows the real structural member as a reinforced concrete lintel. This is the steel reinforcing right there, concrete, that then has a steel with a steel shelf angle that carries a row of bricks that is meant. So the steel shelf angle is followed by flashing, and then it's carried by a row of bricks arranged as a soldier course that, again, is meant to represent a lintel. Or alternatively, and then there's the weep holes. Or alternatively, a stone lintel can be used that is at most carrying the relatively light load of the brick veneer above it. Now, since I'm on the subject, it might be instructive to take a quick look at some modern construction details at Notre Dame, just a few. These can be divided roughly into details of buildings with a modernist aesthetic and details of buildings with a postmodernist aesthetic, including our current neo-collegiate Gothic efforts. What these all have in common is that they both employ modern constructional materials and techniques. Where they differ is that the modernist buildings, of which these are examples, is that the modernist buildings use materials, particularly bricks, in ways that bricks would never be used, for example here, if the bricks were being employed with any sense of their real structural characteristics. Whereas the postmodernist buildings use modern constructional techniques to represent traditional structure, as for example here in the new Jordan Hall Science Center, where the impressive-looking arched entrance is not really an arch, but rather a cast stone veneer hung upon a precast piece of concrete, as is currently happening in the building next to us. It's similar to the similarly constructed representational arch in the new addition to the law school. Of course, Notre Dame does have buildings on campus that are examples of traditional masonry bearing wall construction. And by now I hope you're beginning to get a sense of what to look for to determine if a building is traditional or modern in its construction. Not surprisingly, the traditional buildings on the Notre Dame campus include and are located around the main building and the basilica. And what you will see in these traditional buildings are bricks and stone used sometimes crudely but always correctly to make lintels and arches above door and window openings in the masonry wall, as can be seen here. And here at Bronson Hall is an example of a true arch. Right? This is a true arch, and this is standing underneath the arch, looking at the keystone to it. That's a real arch. That's not a fake arch right there at Bronson Hall. And then here is an elegant and correct use of limestone in the masonry-bearing walls of Bond Hall. Now, is it a coincidence, or I should say it is not a coincidence, that these traditional buildings are located mostly in what could accurately be called the old pitched roof part of campus, part of the Notre Dame campus? And it's instructive to contrast the old pitched roof western side of the campus with the 1960s and 70s flat roof eastern side of the campus. Barring some willful act of destruction, there is simply no question about which of these groups of buildings will last longer. The older ones on the west side will get older, and the newer ones on the east side will decay sooner rather than later and have to be replaced. The newest buildings on campus are better than their modernist counterparts, and one can see here how Jordan Hall aspires to be part of the same family of buildings as the traditionally constructed South Dining Hall. And yet, when you look closely at our newest buildings, the expansion joints give the game away and announce to us that their similarity to the older traditional buildings is in fact only skin deep. Now, moving back to our stewardship and sustainability themes, this is not good news. And the reason why can be partially illustrated by traditional architect Leon Creer's drawing, which he did after he had been a visiting professor at Yale in the early 1990s. I don't know how well you can see this, but basically he's showing at the top, buildings, Yale University's buildings age in their first major maintenance campaign. 1900, buildings that are so well built that their first major restoration occurs in 1990. In 1925, you have buildings so well built that their major restoration occurs in 1990. In 1950, you have buildings so well built that major restorations occur in 1990. In 1975, you have buildings so badly built that major restorations occur in 1990. Okay? And here it might be good to recall that traditional architects generally concur with the characterization of the purposes of building articulated in the 1st century AD by the Roman architect Vitruvius, that good building properly concerns itself with durability, comfort, and beauty, with durability being a necessary condition for the other two. So here's Creer's cartoon on the quality of the buildings at Yale as they were built during the course of the 20th century, at the beginning of which Yale's architects and builders were more or less traditionalists, and at the end of which they were entirely modernists. Now, this cartoon is kind of funny, but it's really no joke. As Exhibit A, consider the Yale Architecture Building, right here, which was completed and opened in 1968. This year, at the age of 40, it has been renovated and expanded at a cost of $130 million. All right, so this is the building, there's the expansion, there's the addition to it. Okay, so at the age of 40, it's been renovated and expanded at a cost of $130 million. Now, part of that cost was for an 87,000 square foot addition. But making a generous cost assumption of $500 per square foot for the addition, that still means that Yale spent $85 to $90 million to renovate a 40-year-old building. But if you think that that was bad, or that Creer exaggerates, consider the case of Frank Gehry's recent building at MIT, a 400,000 square foot building which opened in 2004 at a cost of $300 million, or $750 per square foot. Wait a second. I missed a slide here, I think. Nope, that's it. Less than 5 years later, MIT is suing Gehry, alleging that flaws in Gehry's design, quote, caused leaks to spring, masonry to crack, mold to grow, and drainage to back up, end quote. That old devil water strikes again. Now, before I move on from the problems of modern construction, I need to make one last point about the general organization of the modern construction industry, namely that it's modern. The modern culture of building is exactly like the rest of modern economic culture in at least 3 respects. First, the modern construction industry, as we now know all too well, is integrally related to national and global financing mechanisms that seek and promote short-term profits rather than long-term value. Second, modern construction is itself mass-produced and markets and depends upon a mass-produced cornucopia of high-embodied energy material novelties that promote speed of construction and short-term thrift over durability and long-term value. And third, the modern construction industry is bureaucratically organized in order to minimize accountability in an individualist culture of rights that is inherently prone to lawsuits, with several consequences following from this fact. Another way to say this is that although making buildings is an inherently cooperative activity, the modern organization of the building industry is inherently adversarial. It requires architects to produce elaborate contract documents, literally hundreds of pages, that both to do unique details and in order to avoid lawsuits and legal responsibility. It requires a competitive bidding process that encourages cost-cutting and the sacrifice of quality. And it's characterized by Byzantine codes that ostensibly exist to protect the public, but in fact empower not necessarily well-informed politicians that hinder good design on those rare occasions when good design shows up these days, and that simply do not promote or facilitate built environments of the quality achieved by human beings prior to the Industrial Revolution, when communities of architects and craftsmen were themselves part of the same community in which they built and could somehow make good buildings with about 1% of the paperwork required today to make inferior buildings. The bottom line is that there are 2 main problems with the modern building industry as it now exists. The foremost and most immediate is that it has created and continues to create a built environment that in anything but the shortest time frame is uneconomic, unsustainable, and unlovable. The second is that it aids and abets an insane architectural culture that continues to promote architectural aesthetics as a field of experimentation essentially independent of construction. And if you want to see the practical consequences of that, I refer you back to the earlier slides of the Yale Architecture Building and to the MIT project here by Frank Gehry. Now, there's arguably a good that comes from the way the modern building industry is organized, and that is the democratization of land and home ownership. But the downside of modern construction is, if I may be blunt, A, a landscape full of junk, and B, the difficulty of recreating and sustaining a culture of beautiful and durable building. To do that, something different is needed. What I'm here going to call an off-grid culture of building that has the intellectual and financial resources to distance itself from the contemporary construction industry in order to promote, by example, something better. And the interesting thing is that Notre Dame is arguably in as good a position to create and sustain this off-grid culture of traditional buildings as anybody, anywhere. So let's talk about a culture of traditional building, both what it is and how Notre Dame might begin to promote it. And here I want to introduce the discussion of traditional building with a case study of a need here at Notre Dame. Here's an image showing the relationship of existing university graduate student housing to the Notre Dame campus. The two rectangles locate University Village and the Fisher O'Hara Grace apartment complexes. The two circles are 1/2 mile in diameter and represent a 10-minute walk. The circle with the two X's in it is the center of campus, and the X's mark two very important places on campus, the main building and Bond Hall, home to the architecture school of which we want the Notre Dame football team to be proud. The need to which I referred to a moment ago is one that was identified by Father Jenkins in his September address to the faculty, and to which I referred earlier, a general commitment to excellence in the Notre Dame graduate program, and specifically commitments to review existing graduate housing, B, create a graduate residential master plan, and C, pursue more diligently the university's commitment to environmental sustainability. Now, it's evident to anyone who knows Notre Dame and who has eyes to see that Notre Dame possesses the resources to love and maintain the places that are important to it. Sadly, the same thing about importance can be said when one looks at the current condition of graduate student housing. And President Jenkins' commitment to review and improve graduate student housing is both welcome and needed. I don't mean this to be cruel, but I've had occasion this semester to see with my urban design students some public housing in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is shown here, and myself familiar with public housing in Chicago, and know by reputation the notorious workers' housing blocks of the former Soviet Union. And I have to say that University Village married student housing is clearly part of the same family. And just to be clear, I want to suggest that the problem is not so much communism or liberalism or university intentions and affections as it is the systemic and chronic inability of the modern culture of construction to deliver a satisfying and durable, let alone beautiful, built environment. I have friends who have lived in University Village and graduate students who are also friends who live there now. And the story that I'm told over and over again is that University Village is a great and supportive community of young families, but the buildings themselves are terrible. One resident told me that he had witnessed graduate students arriving from foreign countries, had witnessed them arriving here and burst into tears upon seeing their apartment. Clearly, this is not good. And the university community is right to be thinking of doing something about it. The question is, what should we do? What follows is my suggestion for thinking about it differently than we typically do, and specifically, again, harking back to Father Jenkins' address, to think about it in terms of Notre Dame as a kind of contemporary polis that, like an ancient polis, was both concerned about the life of its members and also had a local culture of building. So here's my proposal. Notre Dame should create and nurture an in-house university community of traditional builders. Call it Our Ladies Guild for Traditional Architecture and Urbanism, or the Guild for short. And let the Guild's first project be the construction not just of graduate student housing, but of an exemplary neighborhood for Notre Dame's married students. See, I'm working my way back to both the family and the village here. So to do an exemplary neighborhood for Notre Dame's married students, for Notre Dame graduate students, and even for faculty and staff who would be interested in living in such a neighborhood. The Guild would be full-time employees of Notre Dame and citizens of the Notre Dame community. And why not? Notre Dame is not just students and professors and administrators. The Notre Dame community includes cooks and dishwashers and firefighters and paramedics and police officers and custodial staff and groundskeepers and accountants and fundraisers and investment analysts and nurses and other medical personnel. Why not also have, as regular employees of the university, a permanent staff of masons and stone carvers and timber framers and finish carpenters and plasterers and ornamental ironworkers? Let them begin by building durable toward beautiful graduate student housing. Simple, small, repetitive buildings with variations under the radar, north of the campus on the current site of and to replace University Village. The Guild could hardly do worse for the married students than what the married students have now. And if they get really good at their work, the Guild could be turned loose on the main campus to replace our modern buildings as our modern buildings deteriorate. And there is an additional upside for Notre Dame. Although traditional construction is more expensive initially, traditional buildings invariably retain and increase in value. So what might this proposed neighborhood look like? And what would these traditional buildings look like? And what would a culture of traditional building be like? And exactly who would build these buildings? And would they come live in South Bend? And do they exist? And if so, where can we find them? And what advantages to Notre Dame and beyond Notre Dame might accrue from the work of the Guild? Excellent questions all, if I do say so myself. And let me briefly try to address at least some of them. The first thing to say is that traditional... How am I doing on time? Okay.
57.
All right. The first thing to say is that traditional building is historically of a piece with traditional urbanism, by which I mean a typical pre-1950 human settlement containing within itself a mix of uses within pedestrian proximity of each other. This traditional urbanism has a formal order that invariably entails a reciprocal relationship between buildings and shaped public space, and whether in big city neighborhoods or in small towns, historically exhibits variations on a limited set of fixed spatial forms. Space in these places is not a vague or ethereal or slippery or amorphous concept. Rather, urban spaces possess specific names that denote a variety of specific spatial types. The park, the common, the plaza, the square, the boulevard, the avenue, the street, the alley. Traditional urban spaces, all. Most all of which, along with a variety of goods, services, and activities, can be found within a 5 to 10 minute walk, which is what this circle represents around the historic centers of Venice, Amsterdam, and Florence. The circle is a half-mile diameter, and it takes 10 minutes to walk a half mile from edge to edge, 5 minutes to walk from center to edge. So you can get a sense of the quality of culture that you can get within 120 acres from looking at that diagram. Okay, so what would a traditional culture of building look and be like? Some of its yeah, the one on the left, yes, is worth looking at closely. Some of its characteristics have been touched upon in our earlier considerations of modern construction. In contrast to modern construction, traditional construction would return to a way of building in which, once again, there is an integral relationship between structure and enclosure. As a culture, it would exhibit a certain kind of ascetic sensibility by placing voluntary constraints upon itself in its use of building materials. And to produce genuinely traditional buildings, it would tend to limit itself to a low embodied energy, low embodied energy and low coefficient of thermal expansion material palette. For example, masonry-bearing walls, high-lime mortar, slate or tile roofs, heavy timber floors, and roof structures, and would be characterized generally by pitched roofs and vertical window and door openings. There would be no need for expansion joints. My colleague David Marinick, in a fit of polemical genius to which he is frequently subject, has actually proposed a one-page common-sense code for urban architecture that he calls the dumb code. And it possesses just these features. Its objective is to reestablish durability, beauty, and craft in building, and establish standards for urban architectural harmony without prescribing stylistic constraints. And the thrust of his argument is that this can be done simply by limiting ourselves to the use of masonry-bearing walls, pitched roofs, and durable materials. No steel lintels allowed, and no steel-reinforced concrete. The consequence of this kind of self-limitation would be a physical environment of walk-up, party wall, essentially fireproof buildings that are naturally cool in the summer and can be insulated to retain heat in the winter, and the construction of which would result in the kinds of urban spatial definition that is common to traditional towns and city neighborhoods. But there are other benefits as well, notably environmental benefits. Architect Steve Mouzon refers to traditional architecture and urbanism as the original green, which he contrasts favorably with today's enthusiasm for what he calls gizmo green, the latter being the kind of sensibility that would award a LEED Platinum Sustainability certification to a suburban glass office building with recycled water and a roof garden that all of its workers have to drive 10 miles to get to. He presents extended arguments on his website for how and why traditional urbanism is and has always been green by virtue of its being, first of all, nourishing, that is, proximate to local food sources. Second, accessible to pedestrians, animals, cyclists, and motorists. In other words, accessible in the sense that all of them can get around within the city. Serviceable, that is, having a variety of goods and services within pedestrian proximity. And secure, that is to say, defensible not only by gates and police, but by residents themselves. Similarly, traditional building is green by virtue of being lovable. And that's really critically important if you think about it, right? I mean, if any of you ever try to save a building, it's a lot easier to save a building that people love, right? Similarly, traditional building is green by virtue of being lovable, durable, flexible, and frugal. Finally, a traditional culture of building at Notre Dame would differ from the culture of modern construction by being fundamentally cooperative rather than fundamentally adversarial. Both patrons and builders would be members of the same face-to-face community. Construction principles based upon a shared communal commitment to the quality of the built environment would set parameters for both patrons and builders. Non-adversarial construction procedures would allow predictability of construction costs within the constraints of the community's commitment to quality. And finally, a cooperative culture of building would eventually decrease the number and kind of construction drawings and contract documents that are required for quality building. So an obvious question is there anybody out there today who is doing these kinds of quality built environments? And the answer is, sort of, but not with the potential for doing it as well as Notre Dame could and should be able. My students and I spend a lot of time traveling to see good environments and talking to people who are trying to revive the traditional building and urban design arts. What places and people are particularly instructive to us? I want to mention 4. The Florida coast, which I haven't taken students to, Starkville, Mississippi, Bruges, Belgium, and the American College of the Building Arts in Charleston, South Carolina. And I want to tell a quick story about each. The first is the Florida coast, where Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zybert have for more than a decade now been conducting what Duany calls experiments on the very rich, where the objective has been to create new beachside communities of such architectural and urban quality that middle-class Americans observing it might be persuaded that it's okay to live in denser urban environments than it is to live in suburbia. If the rich people are living in a dense urban environment, maybe it's okay for middle-class people to live there as well. Now, I don't know how realistic that objective is, but I do know that the resort communities of Alice Beach and Rosemary Beach on the Florida Panhandle and the community of Windsor in Vero Beach are the finest accumulation of good new buildings that I have ever seen. Beautiful, durable, and though perhaps not made in strict accordance with the Dumb Code, made very well nonetheless. And one of the perhaps unforeseen consequences of these wealthy developments has been a notable improvement, so I'm told, in the general quality of building craftsmanship in these coastal communities in Florida. And this can only be good. Nevertheless, the houses in all of these Florida beach communities are not only well built, but also sizable, and that means expensive, coming in routinely, I'm told, in the millions of dollars. So here's the dilemma. If today you want to build well in a traditional manner and remain affordable, or even something approximating affordable, affordability is an odd notion, but something that middle-class people can buy. If you want to build well and make something that middle-class people can buy, you have to build small. In a certain sense, this is not a dilemma for Notre Dame graduate students who are housed in a compound of small units that are not well built. Small, well-built units in a good neighborhood environment would be a substantial upgrade. But is there anybody out there building well who is building small? The answer is yes, and one example of that is Dan Camp in Starkville, Mississippi. Dan's the guy in the middle. Starkville is the home of Mississippi State University. About 30 years ago, Dan Camp left his tenured position on the Industrial Design faculty of Mississippi State to go into building and development. and in the time since has been steadily and patiently developing a 10-block area adjacent to MSU, down there, that's Mississippi State University, from what was a slum full of vacant lots and dilapidated housing into a high-density mixed-use neighborhood of privately owned rental housing aimed at the college student market of MSU, a neighborhood that has come to be known as the Cotton District. I say privately owned. He's the private owner. I'll get to that in a second. An area that's known as the Cotton District. Camp works not exclusively, but primarily in Starkville, and he works with local lending institutions. He builds with good materials, not quite to dumb code standards, but good by almost any other measure. He emulates the best building traditions he sees, both locally and from increasingly extensive travels. I should say something about these buildings. This is a set of 4 buildings on a block that he calls the 4 Apostles. This is rental housing. The footprint of these buildings are 14 by 28. They're 2-bedroom units, so it means that the total square footage of these buildings, it's less than 400 square feet per floor. So it's 800 square feet, 2-bedroom apartments that rent for $800. But there's a scale about them and a caricature that I think you might imagine that they're bigger, but they're very small units. They're tiny units. So he emulates the best building conditions he sees, both locally and from existing extensive travels. He makes small units, small dwelling units, to avoid the most tedious of bureaucratic building regulations. He provides nice details, such as wood floors and tall windows that he manufactures himself in his local workshop. He gets $600 a month for a 400 square foot 1-bedroom apartment and $800 a month for an 800 square foot 2-bedroom apartment. He never sells anything, and from the long-term appreciating value of the buildings he has built, he's become the wealthiest man in Starkville. And 2 years ago, he was elected mayor. A textbook case of doing well by doing good, and a model for any young builder or designer who would like to do likewise. Nevertheless, this model has its limitations, particularly in terms of scale and in terms of civic symbolism. Dan Camp's MO can create good private buildings and good streets, but can't by itself make good civic buildings and public squares, unless perhaps you become the mayor. Good civic buildings and public squares require the informed patronage of a community, which is in short supply. Though my conjecture here is that Notre Dame has at least some of the resources required to be exactly that kind of community.
Well, it's about 10 minutes left.
10 minutes? Oh my gosh. Okay. I'm almost done. I'm on the last pages here. So, modern Bruges, it went faster when I was doing it this morning. I'm sorry. Modern Bruges is a city of some 60,000 people, 25,000 of whom live within the 3-square-mile historic center of the city. For some 300 years, from the beginning of the 13th century to the end of the 15th century, Bruges was the most important and most prosperous commercial city of Northern Europe. At the beginning of the 16th century, it ran afoul of the French monarchy and the Holy Roman Emperor, and its fortunes began literally to decline, and Bruges itself plateaued for almost 400 years. Miraculously spared any physical damage whatsoever from either World War I or World War II, Bruges reemerged in the early 20th century as a commercial port, and in the late 20th century as a tourist center, where today visitors can come and see a virtually intact medieval city, improved by some of the genuine electronic and technical benefits of the modern era. Now, the European heart and soul of Notre Dame's architecture program is Rome, and rightly so, for reasons too numerous to mention. Nevertheless, I've been taking my urban design students to Bruges for several years now, and for several reasons. The first is simply because Bruges is a well-preserved and beautiful medieval city. The second is because Bruges, unlike the cities of the Italian peninsula, exists on flat land in a northern climate. The third is because Bruges, at its historically most significant period, was above all else a commercial city and a commercial culture. The fourth is because Bruges has an artistic patrimony of world-class significance, the patrons for which were neither the church nor the state, but rather its bourgeois merchant class. And finally, because commerce in Bruges operated historically for both profit and charity within the framework of a serious religious culture, in the case of Bruges Catholicism, that also manifested itself in buildings, including a significant hospital and housing for the poor known as God's houses. The primary reason I raise Bruges in this context, however, has to do with the issue of making good urbanism out of durable and beautiful houses of small size. Certainly, as this slide indicates, Bruges has many magnificent houses for the wealthy. But the bulk of Bruges is in fact made up mostly of small houses that also help to define good streets. And that do, in fact, satisfy the design and constructional criteria of the Dunn Code. Load-bearing masonry walls, pitched roofs with slate or clay tiles, heavy timber interior framing, and wood or tile flooring. And these are very small units, comparable in size to the one-bedroom and two-bedroom units that Dan Camp has for 30 years been providing to students for their pleasure and his benefit. Bruges housing, much of it several hundred years old and still repairable, is in fact an excellent model for durable housing for graduate students that will actually appreciate in value over time. Even Bruges' housing for the poor, the original God's houses to which I referred earlier, are amazingly beautiful in their simplicity and their elegance. This one is almost 400 years old, and you go through this doorway, and this is the view through the doorway. Organized around an interior court, it remains to this day public housing for the elderly, but it could serve families with small children just as well. Finally, I note in passing that Bruges is historically Catholic, and Catholic piety in Bruges finds expression in more than 400 Madonnas that are located apparently randomly in exterior walls and niches throughout the city. Again, an attractive model for a seriously Catholic and seriously urban and university culture. Finally, to address the question, is there anyone around today who can still build this way? I offer for your consideration the American College of the Building Arts, at which the following slides were taken this past August, just prior to the start of their fall classes. Prince Charles's Foundation in the United Kingdom has an extensive program in support of the traditional building crafts, and there are local cultures of traditional or quasi-traditional building that are starting to develop slowly around the Florida Gulf Coast and around Charleston, South Carolina. But the ACBA is the only program in the United States of which I know that is systematically training a younger generation in the traditional building arts. At the ACBA, students get a liberal arts education while pursuing a major in one of the following 6 fields: masonry, which is illustrated here, some of the masonry mock-ups, stone carving, heavy timber framing, finish carpentry, interior and exterior plastering, and ornamental ironwork. It's a 4-year course of study, and I think that their best graduates should be hired by Notre Dame to come be a part of Our Lady's Guild for Traditional Architecture and Urbanism. This is the end of my prepared remarks, but I do I've made mention of a proposal for graduate housing that I've been working on with the assistance of several of my graduate students for the last 3 days. So this is a slide just that compares the size. This is Notre Dame at the same scale as the historic center of Bruges, right? So this is a half-mile diameter. This is a half-mile diameter at the center of campus. This is the area of the main part of the Notre Dame campus. This is Bruges, comparable size. This is the location, again, of the existing university village and the proposed site of the project that you're going to see. There is a plan of the project interjected onto the site. Let me just mention briefly a couple of features. I did a rough calculation, a very conservative calculation of the number of dwelling units that you can get on that site at 700 dwelling units, and that presumes 1 or 2 people in these dwelling units. So right now, the housing on campus, graduate student housing on campus, there are about 800 graduate students in 334 dwelling units. And this would probably double the capacity of the university's current graduate student housing. There's several things besides housing in this. There are four buildings, public buildings. There's here at the entry, the main entry off of Douglas Road, is a meeting hall and a convenience store that would be located here. The second one is a gymnasium that would be located right here. Third is a chapel that would be located right here. And the fourth is a daycare co-op that would be located right here. There's several public spaces that are prominent. First of all, a green, an open green, which is open to anybody. Could be the scene of graduate student football games. An enclosed walled garden to the north of the gymnasium. And within the boundaries of this configuration, which is modeled after one of the God's houses, an enclosed play lot for small children. Vegetable gardens located to the east of the site, and then the maintenance of an existing through pattern that I guess has been established for a couple of years now, which I'll refer to as Football Saturday Avenue, because I guess now people on football Saturdays, people come in at this intersection and that's the way they drive to park over here. So 6 times a year, we're not going to take that away, and it's an avenue that can accommodate that. This is an aerial view of what it might look like from the southwest, and this is where it is relative to the larger campus, and given its size and location to the larger campus. It's about a 15-minute walk from here to the architecture school and to the main dog park. I'll stop because my intention has been to give you time to ask questions, and I'm sorry I took so long, but thank you very much for
It is 2:45.
It's quarter.
The next session begins at 3.
I can stay, but I'm
stay and ask questions.
Yeah.
And people who want to go to another session, actually, just feel free.
3:15 it says in here, so we might have a little bit of.
I think there's a half-hour break.
There's a half-hour break, so there's some time.
But I will take questions. Yeah, sure.
Phil will handle his own questions.
Yeah.
This is just fascinating. Is there a way that we can access the paper and the slides and everything, so I could look through it more?
At leisure?
At leisure, more again and again.
Well, I guess I have to talk about this with the director of the Center for Ethics and Culture and see what the copyright things are. I'm happy to share it. It's meant to be shared. Although, again, I mean, this is not an official presentation. I did not represent the university in this. So, yeah.
One of the so I have lived in the village for 5 years.
Okay.
And one of the everything you say is true, perfectly true. One of the things we always wished was that we were more part of the central community, and your mock-up still has us out, where we refer to it as, it looks like a concentration camp, and it's actually part of the university, even though you can't tell. Is that just for space reasons, or I'm just curious why? Or I mean, I know this is just
I mean, this was conceived, and it was done very hastily. I don't know. I'd have to give it some thought. Honestly, I'd have to give it some thought. I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages. I can certainly understand the graduate students wanting to be closer to the center. At the same time, there's a planning principle it's a kind of colonization, right? There's something here you might notice. There's buildings right along this edge of 933 or 31 there, and I guess in my own mind I'm imagining that if we get a couple of good buildings that began to define 933 as a street, that it might over 50 years or 100 years spread up Roseland and actually start to make the whole place a better urban environment. But the other thing is that I think that part of the idea here is that, I mean, certainly what you say about the sense of isolation makes complete sense. But my hope would be that in providing the kinds of things that we're providing, and also my thought is that priority would be given to married students and graduate students, but that it should be open to university employees. It should be open to faculty, who want to live. Some faculty want to, go live in a suburban area. Some want to live in outlying areas in South Bend. There are priests who live on campus who are part of the community, sort of 24/7. I imagine there's some faculty members who, that would be attractive to them, and something like that might be attractive. So so anyway, those are some of my thoughts on that. So, yeah.
Well, you kind of sort of touched on it briefly with one of the criteria for the traditional green, and also with like the vegetable gardens and the idea of the polyps. But kind of taking your ideas further, are you envisioning sort of an ideal of Notre Dame as sort of a self-sustaining, more or less community that lives and educates off of its own surplus? Or, and if so, does that mean like tuition and salaries?
the Berea College model is that. Honestly, I thought about that a little bit. I didn't have time to to put it in the paper, but there's sort of two basic models for the way that a university relates to an adjacent town. One is the kind of monastic model that sort of withdraws and encloses, and the other is the model where just have a kind of blurring of the edges between the community and the university. Notre Dame is the former, and it seems clear to me, just if I'm correctly drawing the inferences from what I see, that's the preferred model, right? Is that Notre Dame is it doesn't mean we don't engage, but it means that we're sort of buying up turf around to isolate Notre Dame as a community. If that's the model, then it ought to be kind of a mixed-use, walkable thing where the Notre Dame community really are members of a polis. And again, it doesn't have to mean gated walls or no public access or anything like that. But that seems to be the model that Notre Dame is pursuing at the time. Just again from my observations as a bystander. Yes.
It's kind of a quantitative question about the traditional buildings that I've looked at, because my church has been looking about doing the structure, and the basic number that you're given for sort of modern industrial is it's about $100 a square foot. When you say this would be a little more expensive up front, do you have any sense of what kinds of upfront investment it is to commit to a different kind of building?
Well, I'll tell you, it's a lot less than the modernist architect. It's a lot less than Frank Gehry's $750 a square foot, and a lot less than
I would get dizzy in that building.
Charlie Glocken's $500 a square foot at Yale, which I'm speculating about. But it goes back to the issue of affordability and why you make small units. But I don't know, but I'd say $200 a square foot, $250 a square foot. I mean, it's not. Traditional construction is not nearly as expensive as the kind of gyrations that the star modernist architects engage. But you can't do it for $100 a square foot.
Did you have a sense, just a ballpark, of how much it was going to cost to totally redo the University Village in that?
No. I have no. These drawings were produced. They were. I started handing them over. I got help from students, and literally I put them in the presentation at 12:20. So I haven't done those calculations.
Yeah. There's the environmental piece of this, which is about sustainability and durability and efficiency of various sorts. And then there's the human side, which is about beauty and mixed use and human scale and a whole set of those other values. And the running suggestion through the talk is that there's a real sort of almost necessary connection between those two.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could argue for that a little more explicitly. And it seems to me, sort of, as a non-specialist, that at least that it's almost too good to be true that these would necessarily coincide. I mean, why might it not be that environmentally sound architecture might be bad from a human point of view, or vice versa? And what explains the coincidence of those two?
Well, the coincidence of them is that until the modern era, buildings were done under conditions of scarcity by communities, and in the same way that modern culture is a kind of solvent of community, it has dissolved that traditional culture of building. And the problem in the marketplace today, you wouldn't be able to get any traction with something like the dumb code unless it was represented a kind of community consensus to do it. And the problem of trying it in the larger culture is that there's always somebody who insists, and in the way that modern society is organized, it makes a certain amount of sense. They insist that I want to be able to build something cheaply, because if I can build cheaply, then I can have it. But if I can't build cheaply, then I can't have it. And there's always someone who's willing to accommodate that. And the cumulative effect of that is the built environment that we have, and which is why I think the critical. I don't think that this can happen apart from a kind of conscious decision by a community that this is the way that we build here, and I think Notre Dame has the potential to be that kind of community. I don't know. It might or might not, but I think it can only happen. It's a classic kind of Benedictine model. You model what it is that you're trying to achieve, and hope that it has positive effects eventually in the larger culture. David.
It seems there's one problem with picking graduate student housing for Notre Dame as the example, push your argument. It seems to me the two most striking things about graduate student housing here is, as you said, how ugly it is and how just awful it is in one respect. But secondly, how happy the people are. You mentioned this in passing too. We had a colleague come back to policy department who lived over there as a poor graduate student, and he came back as a successful and upper middle class income guy, and was all ticked off that he couldn't move back into graduate student housing, because he thought it was a place where he had the happiest days of his life.
Yeah.
We had a distinguished Confucian professor from Hong Kong who has a palatial condo in downtown Hong Kong, who lived in Census Center here at our center last year with his 3 kids, and he chose to live in graduate student housing and said he liked it better than any place he'd ever lived because of the community.
Right.
Now, your big thesis underneath is that the built environment is essential to living a good and flourishing life. Now, we seem to have a case there, though, where you say it could be better, but what's suggested by the experience there is it's the kind of community that can promote flourishing in spite of this sort of god-awful built environment.
Yeah.
Isn't that a kind of problem for your big Aristotelian...
Only if you think that I'm suggesting that there's a causal relationship between the physical environment and human happiness. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there's a reciprocal relationship, and that human beings, in my experience, are generally happier when the environment is beautiful rather than the environment being ugly. And I think it's odd, unless we're going to sort of dissociate the classical notions of truth, goodness, and beauty, and suggest that beauty's not really that important, or it's just subjective or something. Then I would want to ask the people who enjoyed living there because of the community, if they would have enjoyed it more if it was beautiful instead of ugly. Maybe there's a kind of camaraderie that comes there from living in what I take to be, what people tell me are horrible conditions. But it doesn't seem to me to be necessary to have the horrible conditions in order to have community. At least I hope that's not the case.
So you're disagreeing with the Churchill quotation that you gave?
Actually, what I'm saying about the Churchill quotation is that it's reciprocal. It's reciprocal. I do believe that our physical environment, it doesn't determine our behavior, but it sets certain parameters upon even what we can think, what we can imagine.
We'll bring the formal discussion to a close. Thank you, Professor Bess.